Robert Mugabe, the man who ruled Zimbabwe, often with an iron fist for more than 3 decades, has died at the age of 95. He had been in hospital in Singapore for some time.
Mr. Mugabe was the country's first prime minister in 1980, before becoming president 7 years later, a post he would hold until a military coup ousted him in 2017.
Robert Mugabe was feted as an African liberation hero when he came to power in 1980 as prime minister. At that time, the nation, formerly known as Rhodesia, had endured nearly a century of white colonial rule and 7 years of a liberation bush war. The man who once boasted of having a degree in violence suppressed dissent brutally. Despite allegations of genocide, when an estimated 20,000 people were killed in a crush revolt in a western province, he was elected president in 1990. He married Grace Marufu, 41 years his junior, after his first wife died. In 2000, as black anger grew at the slow pace of land reform, the president authorized the invasion and seizure of white-owned commercial farms, calling it a correction of colonial injustices. This helped ruin one of Africa's most dynamic economies, which shrank by more than a third from 2000 to 2008. With unemployment rising above 80%, several million Zimbabweans fled, mostly to South Africa.
There will never be a regime change here. There will always be the people of Zimbabwe in control.
In 2008, inflation rose to 500 billion%, and disenchanted voters flocked to his opponent in a presidential runoff. But Western-backed former union leader Morgan Tsvangirai was later forced to withdraw when scores of his supporters were killed by thugs. As the West continued to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe over alleged atrocities, its leader expressed his anger at the UN General Assembly.
If they will not assist the inclusive government in rehabilitating our economy, could they please stop their filthy, clandestine, divisive antics?
Described as a brilliant tactician by a former U.S. ambassador, he insisted he could still go on as he turned 88. In his later years, Mr. Mugabe often slurred his words, mumbled and paused for long periods in his speeches. Mr. Mugabe had been receiving care in a hospital in Singapore for an undisclosed ailment for the last few months before he died.
For more, Mark Roughton joins us from Cape Town, South Africa. Mark, there's been a lot of reaction across Africa to what has happened. Tell us some of it.
Yes, I think the response from South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa encapsulates the thoughts and feelings of many African leaders, where he points out that we're mourning the passing, in his words, of a liberation fighter and a champion of Africa's cause against colonialism. We must remember that Zimbabwe achieved their democratic freedom 10 years ahead of those balls even starting to roll here in South Africa. And President Ramaphosa has said that Zim's liberation movement supported our own liberation movement to fight oppression on multiple fronts. So that is what's being remembered most today across the continent so far. We've had a spokesman from ZANU-PF, the ruling party in Zimbabwe, Kennedy Mandaza, earlier saying that there are many things to celebrate after what President Mugabe had done for his country and his people. And perhaps if there was any flaw, it was that he didn't hand over the reins earlier. But even the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change, which is the official opposition in Zimbabwe, Nelson Chamisa, the leader, said that now is the time to highlight President Mugabe's positive contribution and to mourn his passing. He's saying it's a dark day for the family and relatives, and that a giant has fallen. On the street, sentiment is a little different. Some Zimbabweans now living in South Africa feel that, at the most extreme case, it's time to raise a glass, but many still do recognize the contribution he's made to democracy and overcoming colonialism here in the African continent. But let's hear some input from some Zimbabweans in Zimbabwe as well.
He didn't want to give other people a chance. That's my biggest thing. Now we have a huge problem just because he couldn't control his people. Okay, so yeah, it was time. It was time.
it's very sad for such a person like Mugabe to pass on. He was an African icon, in terms of the things that he has done in Zim, and then what he really achieved and stuff, right? So it's a very sad for Africa.
Mark, do we know how Zimbabwe will mourn his passing?
We are still awaiting details of what will be planned. It needs to be remembered that this is the first time that a democratic leader of Zimbabwe has passed away. And it'll be interesting to see what actually pans out. I would expect that there would be time involved with his body being in Singapore. But you know, he himself had said back in 2016 to the African Union that he would remain at the helm until God called him and says, come. He was ousted obviously 2 years ago. But we do not yet have details of what the plans, the formal official plans are to mourn him. As I say, there is a balance here in South Africa, certainly, of respect for the work he did and the change that he brought on our continent, as well as acknowledging that a lot of damage was done in the latter days of his reign as the leader of Zimbabwe.
All right, thanks for that. Mark Rauschen speaking to us from Cape Town.